Okay, so thanks for waiting. So we will now have the Q&A section of the evening. The way this works is essentially, if you want to ask a question, you raise your hand. I will call on you. Michael, our man with the microphone, will come around to you. And if you can say your name, who your question is directed towards on the panel, and then give a concise and relevant question. So with that said, who would like to ask a question first of all?
Hello, my name is Diarmid, and my question is actually for Cormac, but can also be for all three of the Fine Gael lads. So you mentioned there the OVP, your kind of sister parties there in Austria, and kind of, I suppose, across Europe there's this centre-right parties that have traditionally sort of dominated the Eurosphere, but those are starting to wane now. The OVP just lost an election to the Austrian far-right, and I was wondering if you guys have an answer to this sort of growing discontent with the European far-right, especially now it's growing in Ireland, and whether that's a problem of all governments, whether it's a discontent brought about by specifically like the centre-right and kind of the stagnation that's happening under them, or what's your opinions on that, how you kind of deal with that sort of growth, I suppose?
I'm happy to take that. So in Austria in particular, what we've seen is a breakdown of their two-party system. You used to have the two main parties getting around 95%. All that's kind of happened is the right-wing vote has split into like 2 or 3 different parties. Same on the left with the Greens and NEOS. So in that case, it's not so much the OVP have suddenly collapsed out of nowhere. It's just people have more options now than they used to. And it's not the first time the OVP haven't come first in the election. They came third to the FPO and the SPO before in the 1990s, but when they formed a coalition between the FPO and OVP, the OVP still had the premiership because the FPO weren't trusted. So I don't think it's necessarily a sudden decline. I mean, you're just seeing a gradual decline of the two main parties there, and I don't think it's the end because they've had dips, they've had rises in support too. It's just another election. They've been in government since I think it was 1976. You know, people might want something different after 50 years. Hope I answered that.
Okay, next question. Chat over on the left there. You can leave the mic with him in case there's a reply.
Hey, so this is just a question to the whole Fine Gael panel. Cormac mentioned specifically that you're in a party, right, but you can have disagreements with certain policies. What sort of policies like just individually would you maybe have a problem with, maybe see more reform, something that can be improved upon?
Like the one that springs to mind actually is last week. So on a personal level, I thought we should have reduced 9% VAT. I think businesses right across the country are struggling. I think we're doing a lot for them. We've done a lot for them through different stages, different challenges. But I think to recognise that there's a lot of businesses that are closing, and their survival was, in their view, based on the 9% VAT being reduced. Like it's essentially what we did in the last year is increased VAT by 50%. It went from 9% to 13.5%. But when you're in a political party and when you're in a coalition of 3 parties, you can't get everything. So you have to make decisions. So, you know, when you have a certain amount of money available, you make decisions. Should you reduce the USC, which was decided upon? Like that means you can't do the 9% VAT. When you increase the threshold from going from the lower rate of tax to the higher rate of tax, that has a cost. So like, you know, we're a very strong economy at the moment. We're doing very well. But it still doesn't change the fact that when you're in government, you have difficult choices to make. And on a personal level, just because I'm spokesperson in Enterprise Trade and Employment Affairs, and I see on a daily basis challenges they had, that would have been one of mine that I pushed very strongly with. Now, our minister did too, but you're in a coalition with other political parties, and the Minister of Finance essentially has to make a decision at the end. there's loads of others, but that's the first off the top of my head. But you know, you could be in opposition, you could be an independent, and you could voice those things consistently, but you don't have the influence. So there's things that I have pushed while I've been in the parliamentary party that have happened, and you know, the party as a whole promote it, but you know, within the party there's certain individuals that have been pushing something for a long time, and you get it over the line. So you win sometimes, you lose sometimes, but as a whole, you agree to a collective agreement, essentially.
Just to add to that as well, I know that the proposition spoke a lot about housing, and I think it's been really difficult for a lot of people to, as Peadar said, there's a lot of vacant homes in the country, and there is the grant available there to refurbish the derelict buildings. I think it's like a 60% grant or whatnot, but the individual only receives the grant after they spend the money. So a lot of people have to apply for a loan and then show that they're going to get the grant, then spend the money, and then the costs may go up. So it's a risk for some people to actually to bring up these derelict buildings, and a lot of people mightn't be willing to take those risks because the cost of living is so high and it might have a negative effect on them. And the reason I think that is wrong and that should be changed is because, like, on board Planala, and also that, like, the government have in place that the grants go through the councils. Whereas I think that if the delegative legislation bill was to be brought in, that the Oireachtas could create its own constitution for the planning board, and then they could just put forward they could make the rules about it to get the housing and to get the derelict buildings, get them rolling and get more houses on the market. Because I feel like, as Peadar was saying, only 12 homes being redeveloped a month, and it's something taking like 2,000 years until we get all 4,000 created. I think that just shows the failing of the Oireachtas deciding each individual's ministry and, like, for example, Bord Planala's legislation themselves. There's only 15 people and they meet, I don't know, is it once a week to decide all this stuff? Like, it's great for a small country, but with an ever-demanding need for a supply of housing, I do believe it's a failure.
I noticed you make a note to the first right there. Would you like to reply to some of those points made there, Peadar?
Yeah, I think there's an interesting level of agreement there in that last statement there. But just, I would agree, first of all, workplace planning is very weak in terms of housing at the moment. So we don't have enough planners in the system. You know, most of our construction workers are in Australia and Canada. We need to bring those home to Ireland. But one of the key elements that I have a problem with Fine Gael is the lack of ambition for big projects. So we do live in a lopsided country. We live in a city-state. There's many people commuting from Ulster and Connacht and Munster into Dublin every day. That has a massive financial cost. It has an environmental cost. And it has actually an emotional cost as well, because many parents are away from their kids for so long, etc. Now, you look at Denmark. Denmark realised that they had an imbalance in their country. Copenhagen was too big for the rest of the country. So they chose another city called Aarhus, and they front-loaded infrastructure into Aarhus until it grew to a critical size, that it drew down international investment in its own right, and now it's created that level of spatial balance in that country. And as a result, that would happen. If that were to happen in Ireland, it would have a significant effect, because you're right, there's so much dereliction. And one of the things I learned when I was going on the European campaign, so many towns outside of the Greater Dublin area are festooned with derelict houses. Every second house on the main street is actually derelict or actually breaking down. In some towns, you could play hurling on the main street at 1 o'clock on a Friday because there's nothing happening there because everybody's commuted into Dublin. The average age in Balbriggan is 12 years younger than the average age of Killarney at the moment. And at this rate of development, we are going to have a very, very lopsided country with all of the costs that brings. So we need to start to front-load infrastructure into the rest of the country. If you build infrastructure, jobs will come, investment will come in the long run as well. And just maybe if I can, while I have the microphone, it was mentioned earlier about the Apple tax and the corporation tax and the great health that the country is in terms of taxation. I argued in Fine Gael in the Finance Committee that we should reform the loopholes in the corporation taxes so we could bring in more corporation taxes. Fine Gael were opposed to that. I argued for an increase of corporation tax up to 15%. Fine Gael opposed that. I argued for the Apple tax to be allowed back into the country. Fine Gael spent 10 million euros belong to you to fight the Apple tax coming back into the country. And yet it was part of the speech earlier that this was a wonderful chunk of money now that the country had, and it was up to the Fine Gael for it. The funny thing is, if you delete the corporation tax at the moment, Ireland is in deficit to the tune of 5 billion euros. The so-called party of economic prudence is actually dependent upon a really, really exposed level of funds. You have Trump in the States saying that he is going to change the corporation tax. He's going to reduce it to 15% and only give it to those who actually onshore jobs in the US in future. That we are highly exposed to a significant shock in the level of income that comes in, and that will have a significant effect on all the services that are provided and our ability then as well to make sure that people get housing and health and education too. So they're just a couple of points.
I'd just like to, just from an economic standpoint in regards to corporation tax, you said you tried to up corporation tax
To 15%, which it is now.
to 15%, which it is now, and across and across most of the world, Japan, Europe, everybody, most countries are agreeing to it. Michael McGrath pushed for it. I even questioned him live about it. But then, if we kept it low, like Peadar was saying, like Trump and like Fine Gael, we're trying to keep it low so we stay attractive to American investment. We get to keep that investment from America. We get to keep those jobs. Trump himself is even investing in Ireland. His is a lovely hotel in Doonbeg. And if he brings down corporation tax, multinational companies from America mightn't be as attracted to come to Europe, which is true and it isn't, because Ireland is the most attractive place for Americans to come. It's the closest and it's their gateway into Europe. We speak English, they do business with us, we do business with them. But we've increased our corporation tax, as Peadar advocated for, and that makes us look unattractive to American multinational companies.
But the corporation tax is higher now than it ever was, on the 15%.
Yes,
Surely
and
that's
we
the
wanted
opposite.
to keep it low so we stay attractive. Cormac?
Just a short point. It's not up to 15% for every company, though. It's up to 15%. I think it's
If your revenue is above
if your revenue is above 750 million euro. And these are smart companies. These are companies who can afford good lawyers. I'm going to tell you what they're going to do. They're just going to officially split it between multiple different companies so that each of these companies is earning less than 750 million in revenue. And people probably know that when they're making that regulation, you're able to do that, as I understand it. So we are keeping it low. So it's not really as high.
Can I just make one point? It does amaze me that when you have these arguments with Fine Gael, they say you got to be careful with the high net worth value individuals because they might move, but don't be careful with nurses and doctors and Gardaí. Right now, Australia recruited more Gardaí last year than this government did, because they'll pay them decent wages. Our nurses are voting with their feet every year because they'll pay them decent wages. Why isn't the same logic true of nurses and doctors and Gardaí as it is of corporations? And, you know, like you asked the question, why did Robert Watt get, you know, an income of 300,000? And they said, because we live in an international recruitment market. We live in an international recruitment market for doctors, nurses and Gardaí too, but the same logic doesn't hold sway there. Why is that, I would ask you? And why is that the instinct? Why is that burnt into the DNA of Fine Gael? That it is about protecting the high-end income earners rather than those on the middle end. And unless we actually change that, like even the university here at the moment, okay, we have about, in this country, in terms of our medical schools, the majority of students are actually from outside of the EU. Why is that? Because they pay 150 grand for their degrees. And the students that are from Ireland get a far less from the government. So because the majority are outside of the EU, the majority of students end up leaving when they graduate. So last year, 700 doctors graduated and 400 left the country. So what I'm saying is we have to make sure that we invest in our education. We have to pay a decent job to doctors, nurses, and Gardaí. We have to hold the same logic true for them as we hold true for high net worth individuals.
John, you've had your hand up for a while, so
Yeah, I was just building off Peadar's point earlier about the loss of revenue if there was to be a withdrawal of multinational funds. Obviously, that would be directly from taxation, but it would also have indirect things, particularly from a city zoning point of view, that the likes of Dublin, even where I'm from in Galway, they're very dependent on American or multinational corporations, and like there's a lot of office space and a lot of retail and employment that's built around it. So, and while I do think the foreign direct investment in Ireland has been net positive, if there was we should definitely look to make our economy more resilient, as there are factors there which are beyond our control, and we should just look to stabilise and be aware of all the negative impacts that could occur.
I believe that we can all agree with what John was saying about building a resilient economy in regards to FDIs.
With that, we'll move back to the audience. Question there at the back, yes, Sorka.
So this is for Senator Garret Ahearn. So you mentioned you think the government has responded relatively well to the Ukraine war and the coronavirus crisis. Do you think, do you also feel the same way about the response to what's happening in Gaza and Lebanon, that's been adequate enough? And how likely do you think it is that your party will enact the Occupied Territories Bill now that it's supported by the Dublin City Council?
The short answer to the Occupied Territories Bill is I don't suspect it'll be enacted. I think we've done an awful lot for Gaza, to the point that Israel and America are very upset with us, to the stance we've held. We're one of the first countries across the world to recognise Palestine as a state. The new Taoiseach has went out of his way in supporting Palestine. But the Occupied Territories Bill, if you talk to other European countries and ask if we do it, will they follow? They won't. If you talk to people in Palestine, will it change anything for them? It won't. If we do it, they'll say, okay, great, you did it, but it actually doesn't do anything for them. You know, we've done an awful lot to support Palestine. We've been very vocal on Ukraine. We feel as though we'd be contradicting ourselves if we weren't supporting Palestine. You know, we've a historical kind of sympathy towards them because of our own struggles over years. But look, like as a government, we get criticised for not going far enough. We also get criticised for going too far. That probably means we've struck a good balance, really, to be honest.
Daithí, I know this is a point of interest for yourself.
Yeah, so no, I'd 110% disagree that the government has done a good job when it comes to Gaza, and especially the situation in Palestine. Like, I was there last year, and it's small steps like enacting the Occupied Territories Bill that does go a long way. And I think if you were to ask Palestinians, we have put this into our legislation about enacting the Occupied Territories Bill, I don't think they're going to tell you that, no, it doesn't make any difference to us. Because at the end of the day, Ireland is a big player when it comes to foreign relations. You know, you can agree or disagree with instances when people went over to the US, but at the end of the day, especially when it comes to EU, we have our part to play. And I don't think the government has gone far enough. And I don't think the government would have went anywhere near where it is, bar the people who are protesting. But the people who are protesting on every Saturday in Dublin, having weekly vigils over the October, what's happening in Gaza. And if the people didn't go that far, then Fine Gael wouldn't. And especially now when we're coming to election season. And Simon Harris, you know, he's playing the game. He's the doctor of spin. You have to give it to him. But he would not have gone as far or done what he's done if there was an election coming. So that would be my take.
Cormac, I know you're very interested in foreign affairs and Ireland's role that we play in relation to this conflict. So I'd like to know that.
Well, I'm more going to focus in on the question. The Occupied Territories Bill itself, we can't pass it. It's against EU law. Trade is governed by the EU. Anyone who's saying the government can pass it is lying. That's just the truth. We cannot pass it. Although it's a bigger violation than anything Orban has done if you go by the rules. The other thing is, since you mentioned Dublin City Council were debating it, why were the County Council debating it? I mean, there's still potholes on the roads. Foreign relations has nothing to do with the county council. We have a situation where county councillors are focused on foreign relations and TDs are focused on potholes, when it should be the other way around. I don't think the county council should have spent time on a foreign relations issue.
Can I just say that that's a masterstroke in deflection? It's like, here's Gaza, but look at the potholes. Look at the potholes. Like in fairness, I do understand obviously that it's above their pay grades to a certain extent, but this is a serious moral question that is really important for so many people. Like what's happened in Gaza is one of the darkest chapters of human history, and it's happening, live on our screens on a daily basis, and it's just absolutely heartbreaking to see it. And in many ways, I do agree actually that the government have come further than I ever expected them to and I'll grant you that. But I still think that America is underwriting the horror that's happening in Palestine at the moment. And the EU is sitting on the fence. Ursula von der Leyen's language has calmed down in terms of her support initially to Israel in relation to it. But in actual fact, there is no major pressure coming from the EU to force a peace negotiation. And when Blinken talks about a peace negotiation, he is absolutely not telling the truth. That is simply a press statement for the Democrats during the elections coming up, because there's no interest at all in Israel in a peace negotiation at the moment, and they won't until the international community stands up to them.
When it comes to Cormac's point regarding the legality of the occupied territory bill, do you have a response on that? The illegality to pass it?
So we had a similar argument when it came to the government looking to change, let's say, economic ties with Russia at the start. And many of the arguments was that we need to have sanctions in terms of the European Union. But in actual fact, there is a competency within Ireland to have sanctions in relation to countries. We can still decide to sanction a country economically ourselves. We don't have to actually come under the European law in those terms. And in actual fact, it would be a wonderful example of humanitarian leadership if that's what we did.
Yeah, so you could do that technically, but from a diplomacy perspective, we're not going to do it unilaterally against the EU. So Cormac says we can't pass a bill, and he's right. What we could pass is a motion in the Seanad recognising the Occupied Territories Bill. But again, that won't happen for two reasons. It has no effect, and it actually goes against EU's view. So what we need to do is work our diplomacy within the EU to have an EU position. And when people criticise us that we've not done enough, my question to them straight away is, well, name another EU country that's done more than us.
So, the EU is a good thing. The EU is a positive thing. I want Ireland to be a member of the EU. But we don't have to outsource everything to the EU. We can actually take democratic decisions in this country ourselves. Absolutely we can. And, I remember when Ursula von der Leyen was marching the world stage, distorting our foreign policy in terms of what was happening in Palestine. That was wrong. That was clearly wrong. And, again, we outsourced that competency for foreign policy to Ursula von der Leyen. The EU should be a partnership of nation states working together for common interest. This, again, is a difference between, let's say, Fine Gael and Aon Tú. There is a federalist instinct within Fine Gael when it comes to the EU. There is, and I don't think that would be probably rebuffed by some in Fine Gael, that there is many in Fine Gael who believe that we should move more. And even the Common Defence Union that Ursula von der Leyen is talking about, it's quite incredible that the Taoiseach has stated we should get rid of the triple lock. The Taoiseach has stated that he's happy to see treaty change, which would get rid of our veto in terms of defence issues, and that would completely scupper and undermine our ability to remain militarily neutral. And military neutrality is important to us because small countries, if they align with big military blocs, never have a say over what decisions they make, but have to give young men and women over to those military blocs to fight in their wars. And many of those military blocs will fight wars according to their own national interests. And we saw that in Iraq and Afghanistan, in Libya, in all of those countries as well. So I would actually like to see more powers coming from Brussels back to the nation states, rather than what is the Fine Gael instinct of moving power from the nation states to the European Union.
That sounds like
No, it's not. It's not. And
thing
see, sorry, can I just say this? Just
That was a line that Nigel Farage had, bring the power back to the UK.
it's also
The one thing I will say,
Padraig Pearse had the same line.
Allow Senator Ahearn to reply.
I agree with you in terms of outrage about what's happening in Palestine, about America being complicit in it, about Ursula von der Leyen's comments at the very start. But the very first Prime Minister in the European Union to criticise Ursula von der Leyen was Leo Varadkar. We've been first of any European country on all of these issues in relation to Gaza. But the difference between being in opposition and being in government is you don't do things, or you very, very rarely do things unilaterally. I can't remember what country we agreed to recognise Palestine as a state with, but Portugal, was it? Norway and Spain. Like, that's only 3 of the European countries, but we decided to do it because we felt it was important. But normally, what we try to do is diplomacy within the EU to create an EU position that we agree with.
So it is a political trick to reduce self-determination down to a binary question of Brexit or staying in the EU. There are actually subtle spaces in that spectrum of politics, and we in A2 believe in self-determination. You mentioned that Farage was supportive of bringing power home. So was James Connolly and Padraig Pearse, in actual fact, and forefathers of Fine Gael as well, in those terms. So we do want to see self-determination, because the truth of the matter is, people will make a better job. You'll make a better job of determining your own future than the person sitting beside you. And if you hand too much power to Brussels, or too much power to Berlin, or too much power to London, they won't always make decisions in your interest. And that's why it's important to have that balance of shared sovereignty, but also the ability to self-determine on important issues such as foreign policy.
John, I think you have a point to make on that.
I would differ slightly with Mr. Tóibín in that I think in the modern day a lot of our issues are international, and the ability of states to fully tackle them is limited. That, as I've mentioned, Ireland is behind on its climate goals, but even if Ireland was to meet and exceed its goals, if the rest of the EU doesn't keep pace, that will not address the issue properly. And similarly with the migration crisis in 2014 and 2015, one of the big issues was that states were acting alone, and there wasn't a unified European method of dealing with migrants who would come in, and people were left with massive waiting lines in one country, which was actively incentivising them to simply push further into Europe. And I think in the modern day, the rise of a lot of issues go beyond the ability of a single government to deal with it, and further cooperation is needed to adequately challenge them.
Cormac, do you want to reply on that?
First I'd like to thank Deputy Tóibín for his earlier compliment. And second of all, it's kind of weird hearing the argument of, Ireland needs more power, we need more sovereignty, but also don't abolish the triple lock, which gives America, Russia, China, and France a veto over what we do with our military. And also the UK, who aim to say they want to liberate Northern Ireland from. It's a case of, do we want sovereignty or do we want to be ran by foreign powers? And it's a case of, you can't have it both ways of, I oppose this, but I support this. It's that kind of argument. I don't really see what's wrong with abolishing the triple lock. You can still be a neutral country. We're the only country with the triple lock. We're the only country who let other countries tell us what we can do with our military. It just doesn't make much sense in this day and age.
I suppose kind of just firstly remembering what the motion of this debate is. And
we have managed to make a bit of a segue into international.
I'll make a segue back to neutrality, don't worry, because Fine Gael has been eroding it for a long time, and I want to touch on that. But especially coming up to our general election, and personally myself, and I know there might be a lot of people here in the room, a lot of my friends, Palestine is one of the main issues that they will be going to the ballot box and voting for, I think rightly so. But let's remember, when it comes to the European Union, who was Fine Gael endorsing in the European Parliament to become the next president of the Commission? That was Ursula von der Leyen, one who has been a staunch defender of Israel's right to inflict what is happening in the Palestinian and genocide. And then going back to neutrality, Fine Gael has been eroding our neutrality for years and years, since the 80s. But on top of that, how can they even speak about this triple lock when they do not resource or put enough income into our defence forces to even build up enough? So how can you mention the term neutrality and changing the triple lock when we literally do not have enough to fund our own defence forces?
Brendan will allow you in a second. Peadar, on the matter of the triple lock.
Yeah, Daithí's right. Like right now, look at our defence forces. We can only float one boat in the Navy at the moment, which is an incredible situation, right? So much of our seas we are unable to actually police or look after. So much drugs, people trafficking happening on our maritime territories at the moment. The army is down to below 7,000. It's meant to be at least 9,500. So we and again, because they're not being paid properly at the moment. And in terms of, does the triple lock, give a default, right for the members of the Security Council to determine our policy? Well, the point is, the triple lock stops us aligning to military blocs. And you mentioned Russia, and you mentioned America, and you mentioned China. They are military blocs. So by definition, the triple lock stops us aligning to military, to those military blocs. The truth of the matter is, do we have a competency in defence and in the military? Absolutely not. Do we have a competency in peacekeeping? For sure. Do we have a competency in peace negotiations? Damn sure. We're probably the best country in the world with the peace negotiations in the north of Ireland. We have a competency through our missionaries, through our UN people right across the world, our human rights advocates, working in so many countries, building up really good relationships. We could actually be an honest broker in terms of wars that are happening at the moment. Other countries actually take initiatives in terms of trying to hold peace negotiations, even if they're small. And actually, we should work on our competency in terms of being an honest broker for peace, rather than pretending that we have any military power at all, and in effect, aligning ourselves to a military bloc.
I couldn't agree more with what Mr. Tóibín said there about being a broker for peace. But I'd also just like to touch back on what Daithí said about Ursula von der Leyen. I do feel like Germany do owe it to those who support Jerusalem to support Jerusalem. Like I think if she took the standpoint of being opposed to that, Germany would be in an extremely conflicted position.
I don't think historical guilt is any reason for the position that they took at the start, if you look at it in retrospect.
Right, okay. Well, I would reckon the opposite. And, well, if you...
Cormac had his hand up. I'll come to you in one second.
I'll keep this point short. You see, the opposition love to talk about neutrality when it's causes they don't care about. But if I stood here before you being like, you know what, I think we should be neutral on Israel and Palestine. I don't think we should pick a side. They'd rip my head off. It's a case of they want us to be neutral on conflicts they don't care about, but they want us to pick a side when they do care about the conflict. You can't have it both ways. And Ireland has shown we're willing to be militarily neutral, but not politically neutral. True neutrality would be we didn't take a side in any conflict, which most people would say Ireland shouldn't do. Most people would say Ireland should pick a side in most conflicts to support.
Yeah, I don't know one person who wants us to be politically neutral, to be honest. Nobody. We're only talking about military neutrality, and that's the only objective that we have. For sure, you cannot park, your moral compass when it comes to international affairs. But there's actually so much humanitarian. Like there was big debate of whatever we should send missiles, these rusty old missiles that were in Kildare over to the Ukrainians to help them in their war. But in actual fact, if we're going to put money there, we should have put it into actually helping. And in fairness, the government did to a certain extent help the humanitarian effort in those terms. And I do think that there's absolutely you have a right to decide what is right and wrong in world terms politically. But military neutrality is what we're talking about only.
Yeah, just to finish on it, like actually how we got around the weapons to Ukraine was by just selling them to Poland, and then Poland sent them across to Ukraine. But like I think it's just important to remember that when you're in the EU, countries have different perspectives on things. So like, we pretty much agree here between the six of us that what's happened in Palestine is terrible. Not enough has been done by leading players within the European Union and in America in particular, and especially because there's an election happening over there, they're not willing to do anything in case it jeopardizes an election. But we're fortunate in this country that we haven't experienced major terrorism like other countries have in the last 10 years. And when you speak to politicians in France, in Germany, their view on Palestine and their view on Hamas is totally different than our perspective. We're very sympathetic towards Palestine, towards the people there. But if you speak to people in France and speak to people in Germany and Italy, their view is it's Hamas are the problem and they need to be eradicated. And it's how do we bring them to a space where we can have a unified position in the EU that supports Palestine, as well as taking into account the sensitivities of those countries in the EU. It's not as simple as just saying we just need to have a unified position on Palestine and that's it. There's very differing views, whether you agree with them or not. They're born out of, historical perspectives. And you have to respect that, and things move slowly, but it's the only way to get to a point that we want to get to. And in fairness, in my view, to us as a country, regardless of who's in government, we've always been very good at trying to move other countries to a position that suits us.
I'll come back to the proposition in a moment, but Paddy down the back has a question on this matter for a few minutes. A point to make
Thanks very much. That might be the longest answer to a question I've ever seen. But just to bring it back to the motion here tonight, a question for the proposition that Fine Gael's time is over in government. There's an old saying in politics that the voters are never wrong. Now, after 13 and a half years in government, Fine Gael had a fairly impressive local election result to be tied as the largest party. Again, they had also a fairly impressive European election result, again, after 13 and a half years in power. So do you guys disagree with the old saying that the voters are never wrong?
Well, it's interesting that Fine Gael's vote fell in the local elections, and Fine Gael's vote fell in the Europeans. Am I correct in saying that? So what happened was it was an elections about expectations. So everybody expected the bottom to fall out of Fine Gael altogether, and the fact that they're still alive, they clapped them on their back for that. So that's a part of it. I think it's interesting that there's three different types of Fine Gaels. There's young Fine Gael, who are kind of like Ogre Tory, maybe. Forgive me, I got a hard lot of slagging from you, so I'm able to give it back. But the Fine Gael of Leo Varadkar is not the Fine Gael of Simon Harris. And you must admit that yourself. Simon Harris has done an about-turn on a rake of different issues. On the issue of migration, Simon Harris has completely repositioned Fine Gael. He got the hate speech bill, he crumpled it up with the ball, and he flung it into the waste paper bin. He is completely changing the direction of the party. He's actually way more streetwise, is what he is, than Leo Varadkar. Leo Varadkar, if he had continued, there was no doubt that there was going to be a gaping chasm between Fine Gael and the people. And I would say that Simon's probably listening to the people a little bit more on a range of different issues. But it goes back to my point that you so kindly read out from my website, is that there is an element of sticking the finger in the air to find out which way the wind is blowing. And I do think that's problematic in politics, right? Because I believe you should stand for something. I believe that you should research the facts. You should have your own moral compass to work out, how you should deal with those facts, and then you should stand for them. And I do think one of the difficulties we have in politics at the moment, and I mentioned this earlier to Daithí, politics has become like a franchise where people kind of literally buy the brands like McDonald's, they stick it above their own shop, and then they work for their own personal ambition to achieve their particular goals, and they'll do pretty much anything to make sure that they're on the right side of the voter. But there's a danger there because there's a couple of key elements to politics. Is people standing up for what they believe in respectfully. And the other part is to be able to engage, to make sure that the competition of ideas still functions within politics, because the competition of ideas is the engine of a liberal democracy. It is where good ideas percolate to the top, people recognize that, and then they become policy. But one of the policies, for example, of Fine Gael was to encroach in that competition of ideas. And thankfully, that law has been, I'm talking about the hate speech bill that has been put aside as a result. And don't get me wrong, I do believe that we are living in a very dangerous time in terms of racism and ethno-nationalism, and that has to be stamped out, and we have to challenge that significantly. It's a curse in our society at the moment. But I actually think Simon's going to do a better job of actually stamping that out than Leo, believe it or not, because he's actually going to listen to people, I think, more than Leo did in the past. But I go back to that point. Stand up for what you believe in. Listen to the research, and use a moral compass to work out the right direction. But don't stick your finger in the air to find out which way is blown, and literally go back and forth any direction at any time.
Are Fine Gael a party that lacks any solid stances?
Like, one of the reasons I'm most proud of being a member of Fine Gael all my life is that we try and always do the right thing. Like, it's very hard to listen to the proposition when it started earlier on about how we're in a bubble and we're out of touch, to now Peadar saying that we actually have a Taoiseach who listens. Like, you can't have it both ways. So while we've been in government, we've had 3 different leaders. And obviously when you have different leaders, you have different priorities, different perspectives. But like, everything that we do as a party is grounded in trying to make the right decisions to improve society. Like, since I was born, all I remember of Fine Gael is going in to fix a wrecked economy. Now, there are political partners at the moment in government, but they're the ones who inflicted it every time. But almost always, and to our detriment politically, we've made decisions that we thought were in the long-term best interest of the country. Like, if we weren't like that, we wouldn't have 16 billion left aside for a rainy day. We'd have just spent it. If we weren't like that, we would have just reduced the USC, and we would have brought in the 9% VAT, and we would have said, to hell with it, we'll sort it out whenever the next government is in play. We'll just do it all now to get elected. Like, if Fine Gael stand for anything, we stand for like being prudent, being respectful of the finances of the state. Of course we make mistakes. Of course there's challenges, and there's obvious things that were brought up today. But what I'd finish on this point is, you listen to the speeches, the 3 speeches on this side. These speeches could have been given a year ago, 5 years ago, 7 years ago. The 3 speeches you heard tonight across from me were all about things I read in the paper in the last 3 or 4 weeks. If we decided to have this in 6 months' time, they'd have new things like a bike shed, and new things like a hut, and new things that they've read in the paper. But ours is consistency of where we were, where we've got to, recognising mistakes we've made, but also recognising that this is a really good country. This is a great country to live in. There's challenges, but there's so many opportunities of prosperity going forward. And like, we were talking earlier on about Gardaí and Gardaí numbers and people not feeling safe. Like, in the Global Peace Index that was released a couple of weeks ago, Ireland's the second safest country in the world to live in, just behind Iceland. You know, if you look at life expectancy in Ireland now is 83 years of age. That's higher than the OECD of 81. Job creation is higher than the OECD. You know, there's so many good things in this country. We have to recognise we can do more, and we will do more. But this is a really, really good country. And it's based on the foundations of decisions that have been made in the last 13 years by this government.
Do you know that it baffles my mind when you say the respect for finances, and you'd nearly forget that we have a housing crisis where we've record number of homeless people. And I said earlier in my speech, 4,401 of those being children. You'd nearly forget that respecting your finances. Our healthcare system. Now, he said, Senator Garret Ahearn said we could take it out from the last 3 weeks of the newspapers, but I've been involved with in politics since I was 16. I'm 23 now, and I think I give a lot of the main speech that I gave today I could have gave 7 or 8 years ago. Like, our healthcare system is disastrous. And even Senator Ahearn, you said in 2023 that the main opposition party's budget was a throwaway budget. Well, look how the tables have turned now. Look at all these the one-time payments that are being made just before an election, which is quite interesting. But what was missing from this budget was any big ideas or any vision when it came to healthcare, when it came to housing. Now, I know I may sound a bit repetitive when I'm saying these things, but these are the major crises the people of Ireland kind of face. And at a time when we have a surplus of €24 billion, they didn't allocate additional money to increase the social or affordable targets that they have for housing next year.
Just on a point of clarity, I didn't say the opposition's alternative budget was a giveaway budget. What I said is our budget could be accused of being a giveaway budget that we announced last week, but it can't because we held money back. And if you're against what we announced in the budget last week, just tell us which one-off payment you're against. Which lower VAT rate are you against? What are you against? What are you against that we're giving people to support them through a cost of living crisis?
So the government will give you 2 electricity credits. Each of those electricity credits will be completely wiped out by the PSO increase and by the carbon tax increase. So they're giving you money with one hand and they're taking it off you with the other hand. So that's the first thing. And Garret mentioned that he could give the speech over the last number of decades. Now, I don't think it's a good idea to have a single transferable speech for every single situation. I think it's a good idea to have a speech that is tailored to the issues that are happening. And the government have been a fiasco factory. So it is our responsibility to challenge them on that. And children were mentioned earlier, and I won't go into the nature because it's quite dark and, upsetting in a way that some of the discussions. I'm not saying you're working right to raise it, but the issue itself is obviously very challenging. But one of the things I will say, last year 100,000 children were referred to TUSLA. Many of them were referred because CAMs are completely understaffed at the moment for mental health. So many were referred that TUSLA are now using a special emergency accommodation system that is unregulated. In other words, the staff don't have the necessary qualifications or the necessary vetting at all. Dozens of children are going missing every single month from those locations. UCD did a study to say that criminal gangs are exploiting those children for sexual abuse. One of those children was found a year later in a brothel at the age of 14. So, it's right to talk about children, but right now, if that happened 20 or 30 years ago, this government would be giving an apology about it. This government would be asking for an investigation on how those children were so poorly treated. This is happening in real time, where action today would have a material difference over the welfare of those children. And yet they weren't in the focus in terms of the investment. And, in fairness, the government did throw cash at certain things, but they didn't fix the reasons why those things are not working. And if we really want to see more people in CAMs, more people, in the hospitals, more houses built, we have to get to the bottom of the dysfunction in the delivery of those services, and that has to happen in tandem with the extra cash as well.
John, I'll come to you in a second. Cormac had his hand up first. Go on.
I'd have to say most of what Peadar said there I actually agree with, especially with the TUSLA situation. I feel the media have kind of been giving that way less attention than it deserves. I feel like if it had been another organization, they might have been giving it more attention. So it's kind of weird how little attention it gets and how little Roderick O'Gorman gets questioned about it. Regarding Daithí talking about the housing crisis, first of all, if Sinn Féin really did have solutions to the housing crisis, they would be implementing them up in the north. And it's not a lack of money in the north because they gave money back to Westminster because they couldn't spend all the money they'd been given to tackle housing. The rate of homelessness in the north is 8 times higher per capita than it is in the south. So the opposition does not have a better solution than we do, I feel. And also, I didn't actually answer Jack's question earlier about
Can I just respond to one
Briefly.
just to clarify, a part of this country is occupied, and the British government maintain control over a lot of the fiscal budget that's handed down to the Assembly up in the north.
So not on housing.
It's across the board that they hand down.
But you had a surplus of budget.
John, go ahead.
Thanks. I would like to just build on the point. With housing in particular, I alluded to it a bit in my speech. While we are spending quite a lot of money on housing, I feel a lot of it just isn't being spent properly, that there's a lot of kind of methods that they're going at to try and abate the situation without just addressing the root causes of the issues, that there's much more cost efficient ways that we could be combating it, rather than kind of throwing money at it in oftentimes quite not a very aimed manner. And I think in particular the investment firms who buy up quite a lot of housing, they in particular are a particular source of the inflation, and the regulation of them in particular would free up a lot of supply for individuals.
I suppose just on the actual the question of the motion, and I mentioned the fact that Fine Gael kind of have split personalities at the moment, that they have, let's say, 3 different personalities. I think, Fine Gael need to find themselves. And I think the best way for Fine Gael to find themselves is to give them a little bit of time off from government, and to let them have time in opposition for a while, and give them that time to find.
The question to that is, who do you want in government, sir?
Well, I actually think that there is a
realistic one now.
I think that's between Fianna Fáil and Sinn Féin and the likes of ourselves, there's a potential for government there. Well, I'll mention this. Right? The reason why I say Fianna Fáil is because, and this is a critique of Fianna Fáil, I think Fianna Fáil are an empty ideological husk. I don't know if they stand for anything at all. And I actually think that Fianna Fáil will go whatever direction they're pulled in a government. And whatever you say about Fine Gael probably do have an ideology. They do have a direction. They do stand for something. Like, obviously, I disagree with it. And you mentioned, obviously, that I agree wholeheartedly that Tusla, the issue there is not mentioned. But do you know the reason it's not mentioned? It's because those children are from families that have no power, that are from low incomes. And that's the reason. And if those families were from high net worth value families, that'd be all over the Irish Times. It'd be all over RT, and that's one of the ideological differences I have.
There's a question here. We'll move on.
Gentleman in the back.
Thanks very much.
Michael.
Sorry, Edward McManus. I'm an Ain't candidate in Dublin Northwest, and one of the issues that's cropped up in relation to students approaching me is, and not necessarily living here, but who live outside Dublin, and they're having difficulty accessing student digs and student accommodation. And it's one of the problems over the last number of years that wasn't there prior to Fine Gael. Whatever problems existed prior to Fine Gael, there was affordable student accommodation. Now, there's been a lot of student accommodation built, but unfortunately, a lot of people, it's great to see the attendance here of young people and great minds, and the future is very, I'm sure, safe in your hands. But a lot of people aren't here because they're living in commuter towns, and they have to get home early, otherwise they'd be here all night. So I think we need to look, and unfortunately in this country, I'm old enough to remember the Pope's visit back in 1979 when the great and the good of Irish society said how wonderful it was for young people, and they all left, they all emigrated. Unfortunately, there's a massive problem in this country, and it's every generation, the 30s, the 40s, the 60s, the 80s, it's not treating young people with respect. There's a certain plumos, you're told you're all wonderful, and it's great that you support Fine Gael. But in relation to giving you housing, giving you a decent standard of living, people are going to Canada and they're going to Australia. And unfortunately, I'd hoped as I'd grow older, things would improve. I have young children myself, and they're younger than you guys are, but it is depressing, and I don't see a future for young people with Fine Gael. Thank you.
I actually think that's a brilliant question, and I was only going to talk about it earlier, but well, you were saying for years and years, and before even 1979, there hasn't been. It's been a great. It probably was a great place for young people to live in Ireland. But my grandmother had to travel to England to study to become a midwife. There was no place for her to study here in Ireland when she was 16. I don't have enough money to pay for my accommodation here. I work in Temple Bar and I do 35 hours at the weekend to pay for my accommodation. Like, it's hard. It is hard to be a student, but it's my choice at the end of the day. Of course, there's grants there from Susie. Like, I chose to come up to Dublin. I choose to pay the rent. I choose to go to college here, but it's tough and it's hard. And if you want to get something good out of, if I want to get my degree, I'm going to work for it. Like, it's great that, and I disagree with the government on this, it's great to promote education for everyone and for everyone to go to college. And one thing I do disagree with, and I reckon Peadar's going to agree with me on this one, is the support for the apprenticeship programmes in Ireland as well. There is not enough support for them. And what we're going to see very soon in this country is that there's going to be a huge amount of people with third level degrees, not enough jobs for those people emigrating, like you're saying, and the need for builders, plumbers, electricians, all these people in order to supply the housing crisis that is going on is going to be astronomical. And Peadar was talking about earlier about how all our builders are in Australia and Canada and we need to bring them back. But what about creating builders in Ireland? Of course, they're gone. And I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm not disagreeing with you that it's a hard place to go to college in Ireland, and that I have friends in my course that have to commute into college themselves. And like, there's ups and downs. And it might have been a great place to go to college before. My aunties and uncles were able to stay in student accommodation, and it wasn't expensive for them when they were in Dublin. But it is expensive for me, and I work and I pay for it. And maybe in 20 years' time, it won't be expensive for your kids when they're going to college. But what I'm trying to say is, there's ups and downs, and you just have to drive on through them.
Okay, trying to speed through the last few questions here. Sean at the back, yeah. Michael will come in.
What I'd like to ask is, the far left in this country will say that the government is doing too little about...
Sean, who's your question directed towards first?
Sorry?
Who's your question directed towards?
Just one speaker from each side.
Okay.
Right. The far left in this country will say that the government is doing too little about climate change, whereas the far right will say they're doing too much. Which is it?
Well, first of all, obviously we believe that one of our major problems is that the whole issue of the environment has become such a divisive issue in recent times. And we think that's partly with the government's approach. So, and I think this is the Greens' fault, to be honest, is that the Greens have used a stick instead of a carrot in terms of changing our practices around climate. So, for example, there's so much we could do in terms of deep retrofitting houses, in terms of microgeneration of electricity, and, farmers for small-scale solar, small-scale wind, biodigestion, for example, even public transport, so that would become cheaper, so that we're less dependent on the car. But if you look at it, a lot of the government's approach has been about taxes. So carbon taxes went up again. Excise went up 2 or 3 times in the last 2 years. The government made 3.5 billion euros last year out of fuel taxes in the middle of the jaws of a cost of living crisis. So what's happening is so many people, especially low-income individuals, people living in rural Ireland and farmers, feel that they're being targeted by the government's approach to climate. And as a result, this has become nearly a wedge issue politically. And I don't believe it should be a wedge issue politically. I think if we did more in terms of the carrot, we could actually bring more people with us in this debate.
Yeah, I don't actually disagree with Peadar, to be perfectly honest. It's not that we haven't done enough, but we definitely need to do more. And it's a challenge. So, one of the biggest challenges we have in terms of climate change is in agriculture. And it takes time to convince people to change their ways, that this is in the best interests of the country, and it's also in the best interests of them. And in agriculture, like most things in agriculture, the only way you can convince them to do it is through payments. And that's been done. But there's a real challenge in that. And you talk about solar farms, and I'm sure Peadar has it up in Meath as well. Planning permissions go in for solar farms, and then communities get together to object against these things. And sometimes politically it's beneficial for politicians to be in that meeting, supporting the objection, we're against it, all this sort of stuff. We all, from all political parties, certainly in Leinster House, need to take a leadership role in encouraging people to change their ways. But, we're not doing enough at the moment, in my view. We need to do more.
John, on that?
Yeah, just to answer your question simply, we're not doing enough. We're on track to miss our 2030 goals by a wide margin. And I do definitely agree with Peadar here that the way that the state is going about it isn't sufficient, isn't the best way to do it. But the short answer is we're simply not doing enough. and particularly, the issue of agriculture was brought up, and farmers are going to feel, in fact, farmers have felt the impact of our climate changing already a lot more than people employed in other sectors. And on the issue of planning permission, I think there's widespread agreement that the planning permission system is very broken, and it has a lot of knock-on impacts across the board, and it's just a question now of going and reforming that. That's slightly separate to climate change.
Okay, just the next question there, the gentleman in front. Sorry, might be 670, is it?
My name is Shane, and the question is for the TD and the Senator. The Trade Union Act in this country requires all workplaces that want to form a trade union amongst themselves to have a negotiation license. For whatever reason, if you want to keep it registered, but my problem comes from the negotiation license costing between 25 and 77,000 euro. Now, AN2's website has a workers' rights section which details the plans to ban 0-hour contracts, have penalties for using cheaper foreign labour as opposed to more expensive domestic labour, and to enshrine unionisation in the Constitution. Now, legally, there is no problem. You absolutely can form a union in your workplace if you have 25,000 euro between everybody who wants to be in it, to form it, to get your licence, to negotiate your own wages. Now, this act was sent in, it became law in 1941, but the last time it was amended was to revoke the negotiation license of the Baker and Food Prep Workers Union in 2019. Now, for the Senator, if you say that Fine Gael needs to have this next election, if they're not on their way out, what are they doing to earn the support from unions if they have not only such a restrictive law on their formation, but in their maintenance as well? I think
that's a fairly technical question, and I'd be bluffing if I knew an answer to it, to be perfectly honest. What I would say is Fine Gael have never been fortunate enough to have the support of the unions in any general election, in my experience. In terms of the cost of it, what most companies do, or employees of most companies, is they join a union like SIP2 or others like that, INTO or Unite. Essentially what they do, rather than setting up a new union themselves.
But sympathy strikes are also illegal between sectors, Senator. So SIP2 is largely negated by between industries work not being able to collaborate with each other to form a sort of general strike. So if I wanted to negotiate with my boss for better wages, I don't get paid enough. I'm sure none of the students here get paid enough. If I wanted to negotiate, then I would have to not only be in a union in the workplace, but I would have to join SIP2 with all the bells and whistles that comes out. Or
yeah, but it doesn't cost you 25,000 euros to join SIP2, is what I'm saying. And if you do want to negotiate a better salary with your employer, and you're a member of SIP2, a SIP2 official can do that on your behalf.
Why should I have to go through a SIP2 official instead of just doing it
But
face
you want to join
face?
a union.
I want to have a union in my workplace. SIP2 is there, but SIP2 is a far-off organisation. It doesn't have, experience with the people on the ground. It doesn't have experience with the workplace where I am. It doesn't know how much I want.
That's a personal view, but there's unions there that represent employees right across the country. No one is stopped. Certainly not stopped from government. Sometimes stopped from Ryanair, but not by government, of joining a union. Anyone is free to do that, to negotiate the best salary and best conditions for themselves.
Why would unions be independent at all then? Why would there be an option to form your own union if everybody was just encouraged to join this one organisation?
Well, it's freedom. You don't have to. But if you want to,
I would be coerced if... sorry, go on.
Yeah, I suppose obviously we believe in the rights. We believe that there should be collective bargaining and the right to collective bargaining, and there isn't that fully within the Irish legal system at the moment. In terms of, I do believe there should be competition between unions. So in other words, you should have the rights to join. In life, if there's a monopoly in a space, it actually isn't healthy because there's a lack of choice in relation to if you're a worker, and also monopolies leads to abuse of power sometimes, by the monopoly itself. I do think there probably needs to be a threshold, though, for where a union can actually form. So, because I imagine if you fracture the union landscape so much that you're going to lead to a very, very difficult space there where you have micro-organizations trying to operate other unions and become very, like, so what I'm saying, there's a balance there, and there does need to be a threshold by which a certain number of workers at least, or a certain bond of such, can actually differentiate between what is a union and what isn't. So, and that would be my response to that question. And again, it is a technical question.
Just time for one quick final question. Sorry, Jamie had his hand up earlier. Just on the left there.
Hi, Jamie O'Connor. So I work in the hospitality section part-time at home in Killarney, and I could walk down Main Street and see 5 businesses that have closed down within the last 8 months. And the government have made a decision to increase the VAT rate back up to the previous rate before COVID at 13.5%. So I guess my question is, how does that benefit local business owners, Irish business owners, and how, like, what's the thinking behind that? Because it's just going to create more job loss because it's on its knees already, the sector.
Yeah, so I presume that's directed at me. Yeah.
Anyone.
Yeah, so like I said earlier when I was asked the question, what issue have I disagreed with my party on recently or in the past, and that would be 1 to 9% VAT. I think we should have reduced it. Like, it always was a temporary measure. That's the first thing. It was brought in as an emergency during COVID, then it was brought in as and then it was retained as during the cost of living crisis. Like, at some point, the view from the Minister for Finance is it had to be reinstated. And that was going to be difficult to do politically, but it was done. I recognise there are businesses that are closing, absolutely. There's also businesses that are opening. Like, Killarney's still a thriving town. It's still doing very well. But it has its challenges, absolutely. I know it well. I got married there. But it's you know, there's a lot of towns right across the country that would be envious of Killarney. But in my view, I think we need to make a long-term view, and I've said this in my own parliamentary party. We need to make a long-term view in terms of what we're going to do to support businesses. Like, it's welcomed. Every business is getting €4,000 before Christmas to support them. There's other measures that have been in place to support businesses over the last number of years in terms of rates, in terms of cost of business scheme that was introduced. But I think rather than having a discussion every single year about what we're going to do about the VAT, I actually think we need to make a decision on where we want the VAT to be for the next decade, regardless of whether the economy is doing well or not doing well, to support businesses. Because, you know, I see it in my own area in Clonmel, a really good town, but, you know, coffee shops and restaurants are struggling. They're full, but they're not actually making much money out of it. And one of the challenges we've had is VAT rates also include hotels. And in my view, an awful lot of hotels, particularly in this city, have been ripping off people. Like, the price is just crazy for tourists coming in, for people to stay in Dublin. And if we're suggesting we should give them a VAT reduction, in my view, is crazy. Like, if we had introduced it, it was going to cost 750 million to do it. Like, it's not small money. If we remove the hotels, which I think we should have done, that would cost about $500 million. Still too much when we're reducing the USC and putting in other tax measures. We couldn't afford it. Then my view was, if we can't afford 500 million, don't introduce it in the 1st of January. We should introduce it in 1st of April, 1st of May, maybe, to give people light that it could be done. But again, that wasn't agreed by the Minister of Finance. But we need a long-term plan in terms of how we're going to support businesses and the hospitality sector.
Yes, I was canvassing in King's Court there the other night, and I was knocked on a door, and a fella said to me, when he was young, there was 6 more pubs in the town, there was 2 hotels, and there was 2 banks. All of that's gone. He says you can't get a hot meal in the town anymore. And the truth, that's replicated among so many small to medium-sized towns across the country. And it goes back to the point that actually, you know, Middle Ireland is actually dying on its feet in many places at the moment. The issue about VAT is a regressive tax. It actually is a tax that lands heavier on the shoulders of those in low income than it does on those in high income. We also have a high VAT rate here comparatively with the rest of Europe. You know, you mentioned obviously the supports. I always think that the government has come up with a kind of welfare for businesses. And I think, you know, businesses want a number of things. They want competitively priced inputs, they want good infrastructure, and they want well-educated people. If you actually get those three things right, actually businesses will flourish by themselves. But if you look at electricity in this country is the highest of any country, in any country in the whole of the European Union. So, like, we don't have good infrastructure. We have extremely expensive input costs. Rip off Ireland's expensive input costs for business. And actually, I agree with you here. I actually think you could have split the market between small to medium-sized pubs and restaurants that are a different business model than the city hotels. Or you could have introduced a city hotel tax, which would put manners on the hotels who actually hike up the prices during concerts, etc. as well. So you could have used a system to segregate those two elements of the market to reduce the cost and keep Middle Ireland alive as well.
Okay, just gone 9:15. I know this has been an hour of fascinating discussion, but we do have to call things at some stage. So a reminder that at the start of the night, the motion was this House believes that Fine Gael's time in government is up. If you agree with that motion, could you please raise your hand now? Okay, keep it up. If you disagree with that motion, please raise your hand now. It's 20 to 8, I think it is. So pass over everyone. Thank you to all the speakers. Thank you to all our speakers and the audience for your questions, and we'll see you again very soon. So that I'll call it the end of the night, and we were on our way to Slipper as usual.